This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today's March 14th, and it's just me, producer Pat. The first thing I wanted to mention is that we had previously announced that we would be doing a live show at Toronto Comic-Con next weekend, but that event, probably not surprisingly, has been cancelled. Now, you may have noticed that while we have been putting out shows, they haven't been as regular as usual over the last handful of weeks. This is for a couple of reasons. As you may have heard, Darren has been globetrotting, Adam also needed some time off for March break, and Christina was supposed to be in Saskatoon for the Junos this week. Now, Darren is in isolation for 14 days, as are a couple of Adam's kids. All to say, we will do our best to keep bringing you shows, but it is proving to be a challenge, and we appreciate your patience. In the meantime, we do have 3 new segments for you today. Dr. Stu Robbins answers a question about Mercury's precession and general relativity, which was recorded as an extra bit in August of last year. And Darren talks to the panel about revealed preferences, which was recorded as an extra segment before he left on his trip. But first, Adam goes solo to tell us about Mad Mike Hughes' rocket crash. We hope you enjoy them and that you're staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
You may have seen the headlines recently stating that daredevil and flat earther Mad Mike Hughes died in a homemade rocket accident while trying to prove that the Earth was flat. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so some things that we can ask ourselves, besides whether it's in poor taste to make fun of the situation, was the accident motivated by a pseudoscientific belief, or more simply, was Mike Hughes actually a flat earther? Now, Mike Hughes was a daredevil. He worked as a limo driver and started his stunt career when he set the world record for the longest jump in a stretched limousine, that being 103 feet or some 31 meters. Pretty impressive. He later got into building his own rockets, something which started in 2002 and lasted until his death last month. He had a few launches over that time with varying success. In recent years, the stated goal of these launches was to confirm whether or not the Earth was flat by launching himself high enough to see either a round globe or some sort of flat disk. So how high does one need to get to notice the curvature of the Earth, or more specifically, the curvature of the horizon? Now, there may be a slight visible curvature even at somewhat low heights, but a person might not necessarily be able to notice it. Maybe a robot would or something like that. Further, there are some complications which will make it appear that the curvature is visible when there might be some other things at play. Barrel distortion is a big one. This is typically seen with many photographic lenses, such as a zoom lens. This causes image magnification to decrease further from the center of what your camera's looking at. If you have the horizon above the center of the scene, it will appear to curve downward at the edges. The opposite effect will occur if the horizon is towards the bottom of the scene, which will cause the edges to curve up a bit like a happy face. Now, usually if you're trying to shoot an image of the Earth or the horizon, you're going to have more of the Earth in the image than of the sky. So you're naturally going to always have barrel distortion, making that surface look a little more round. So one might take a photo from a mountaintop with a certain type of lens, and depending on how it's framed, they might notice a curvature of the horizon, but this would be an optical illusion. This can happen with a lot of cameras. This will also happen with GoPros, which is something that someone might use to send up into the air. One can see a superbly deceptive example of this in a 2017 video shot from a high-altitude weather balloon. This was put together by students at the University of Leicester. In the video, right away you can see that even near the surface, there's obvious barrel distortion making the horizon appear curved when it is in the upper part of the video, having the opposite effect when it's in the lower half and it looks sort of like the Earth is actually caved in, like a happy face. Now, even when at its peak, we see the same distortion, which puts the entire video into question. This camera reached a height of 23.6 kilometers, which should have been enough to measure the curvature, but the barrel distortion really exaggerates the effect, so the video isn't terribly useful. I would say the barrel distortion has a greater curvature than the actual one that the video should be showing. Now, flat earthers call these types of videos out because the barrel distortion is there, and they're right to do so. That said, one can apply filters to remove barrel distortion, and high-altitude balloons can still be shown to show the curve of the Earth when that distortion is removed. And one other way to do it is if you see that horizon crosses the center of the image, then what you're seeing there isn't going to be suffering from barrel distortion. So if there's still a curvature, when it's at the center or below the center, then you know that that's the actual curvature of the Earth. Another video I saw was a Lego man sent to space, and it was a less extreme example of this, but there was still a bit of barrel distortion. So you watch this video and you think, wow, I can really see the curvature of the Earth, but it's a bit deceptive. Presumably, Mike Hughes, who didn't believe it when the man told him that the Earth wasn't flat, wasn't planning to rely on a camera, but planned to view the Earth's curvature with his very own eyes. So how high would he have needed to be? Well, it's gradual, but it seems that at around 35,000 feet, and that's about 10.6 kilometers, one can see the curvature. From about 14,000 feet, and that's only 4.2 kilometers, one can't really notice it. Now, between those two, you might be able to notice it a bit. With a photograph, one could measure it at around 20,000 feet, that's around 6 kilometers, but seeing it with the naked eye might not be so easy at that kind of height. Mike Hughes was working up to trying to get to a height of 62 miles, that being over 325,000 feet, or 100 kilometers, which should have been more than enough to see the Earth's curvature. And this is a height known as the Kármán line. This is considered to be a border between the Earth's atmosphere and outer space, but there is no scientifically clear border between the two, but this is one measure that's used, and that was probably what Mike Hughes was going for. The fatal February 22nd rocket launch was only planned to go up to 5,000 feet. This is a bit less than 1 mile, quite far from the 62-mile goal, and this would not have been enough to prove that the Earth was round. This was kind of a first attempt building up to the later attempt where he would have been able to presumably notice that. Ultimately, the plan in the future was to launch a rocket from balloons, which are already 20 miles up, to help get to the height required. In reality, those balloons would have been more than enough to get high enough to see the curvature of the Earth, but Mad Mike wasn't looking to go for a simple balloon ride. He was a daredevil who wanted to go as high as he could in a rocket. And he would potentially need to go more than 20 miles to photograph the entire Earth as a flat disk. Now, I don't have any specific numbers as to just how high one would need to go in order to photograph the disk of the flat Earth, because frankly, I don't believe the Earth is a flat disk. One person could probably do the math to calculate how high that would be, and I think it would probably need to be higher than 62 miles. But ultimately, he would have been interested in rocket launches even if he wasn't planning to observe the flat or round Earth. I don't believe it is fair to say that his belief in a flat Earth killed him or somehow led to his death. He was a thrill seeker with a passion for rockets, and this wasn't just part of his goal. In fact, he was in rockets before the flat Earth angle was even part of the story. And that can make us ask the question, was he really a true believer? Darren Shuster, who was Mike Hughes' longtime publicist, claimed that this was all an act. He said to BuzzFeed, and I quote, "We used Flat Earth as a PR stunt, period. He was a true daredevil decades before the latest round of rocket missions. Flat Earth allowed us to get so much publicity that we kept going. I know he didn't believe in Flat Earth, and it was a shtick." He was also quoted as saying, "I don't think he believed it. He did have some governmental conspiracy theories, but don't confuse it with that flat Earth thing. This was a PR stunt we dreamed up." So, was this really a publicity stunt? Well, Mike Hughes also was quoted to say, "I believe the Earth is flat. This flat Earth has nothing to do with the steam rocket launches. It never did. It never will. I'm a daredevil." So while he did claim that he believed the Earth was flat, he probably would have been launching rockets anyway if he could somehow get the funding. And that's the key question. In 2016, Mike Hughes had a failed fundraiser that only earned $310. But after claiming that he believed the Earth was flat, a subsequent fundraiser made $7,875. So obviously, being a flat earther in this case was a good incentive. Now, I can't really say if this is true one way or another. Mike Hughes isn't around to defend his belief. Darren Shuster may simply be telling the truth in saying that it was a publicity stunt, but there are other reasons for which he might say that this wasn't true. Perhaps he finds the idea of a flat Earth being embarrassing and wants his friend to be remembered more fondly. Ultimately, one doesn't need to go to space to prove that the Earth isn't flat. If one watches a tall ship sailing away in the distance, they will see the mast slowly dip below the horizon because the surface of the ocean is curving away from them. One can view stars at different angles depending on the latitude at which they are located. They can use this to infer that the Earth is actually round. And of course, there are things like the location of the sun in the sky, which varies consistently depending on time zones throughout the Earth. If you've traveled a bit and you've ever had jet lag, that's a bit of evidence that the Earth is also round. If you choose to believe what other people say, there are other things like the fact that GPS satellites work and large bodies of scientific evidence related to the Earth, not to mention eclipses and such phenomenon, can really support this idea of a round Earth or an obloid, spheroid Earth. Mad Mike Hughes was a daredevil. He built his own rockets and ultimately lost his life in one. He may or may not have believed that the Earth was flat. If he truly did, then he made an effort to confirm this one way or another with his own eyes. I don't think this is a case of pseudoscientific belief causing harm or death, which may have occurred without the flat Earth angle. I don't appreciate the people I've seen mocking his death. Mike Hughes was a very ambitious man. I don't want to romanticize his death, which was tragic and a very avoidable accident, but what he was attempting to do was impressive, even if it was, in some small way, associated with a misguided belief in something which is demonstrably untrue. All that said, do not try this at home. Oh, and Stuart, thanks ahead of time for pointing out the many things I got wrong in this segment. Peace out, cuboids.
So back on episode 557, there was a question that made it on the cutting room floor about Mercury and retrograde and precession and other things. And Darren, you specifically wanted to know, what does Mercury's precession have to do with general relativity, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily Mercury's precession, because usually we talk about precession with respect to an object's tilt relative to its orbital path around the sun. So Earth has a roughly 23.5 degree tilt, and that tilt angle precesses along the celestial sky.
Stuart, quick clarification. Can you tell us all what precession means?
Right, so precession. Precession is precession of the equinox, so most people might be familiar with that term. This is where the sun, on a given calendar date, as you progress from year to year, will actually appear to rise at a slightly different location in the sky. This has to do with actually Earth's tilt relative to its path around the sun shifting very, very slightly. So if you were to spin a top and that top wobbles on the table, the angle of that spin axis is going to actually stay about the same relative to the table, but the direction is going to shift. And we call that precession. So it's the exact same thing with planets, where Earth's axial tilt will precess over the course of about 26,000 years. So that's not what's going on with Mercury with respect to general relativity. What's going on with that is we call precession of Mercury's perihelion. So perihelion is the closest position to the sun of an astronomical object, and aphelion, APH, is the farthest distance that an object will get from the sun. Now, in classical mechanics, the calendar date of perihelion of an object is going to be the same on its calendar. So on Earth, we are closest to the sun on January 3rd. So it's going to shift very slightly from year to year, and that's due to classical mechanics. So basically, the gravitational pull of all of the other massive objects in the solar system are going to very slightly shift when Earth is closest to the sun. And we can do all that math and factor all of that in, and we did it over 100 years ago with Mercury. The problem is that once you account for every massive object, there is still some remainder left that can't fully account for Mercury's precession of its perihelion. But once you factor in general relativity, you can fully account for it. So what's going on effectively is that the sun is slightly dragging space along with it. And so when Mercury is closest to the sun, it's going to get dragged through space a little bit more than when it's farther from the sun. And so because of that drag, Mercury's perihelion, its location of that perihelion, relative to, you can think of the solar system as a clock, that's going to shift very, very slightly. And we can account for it with classical mechanics only in conjunction with general relativity.
So is the end result of this planets slowing down and falling into the sun, but not before something else happens, like the sun exploding?
No.
No? Okay.
Given the complexity of everything you just said, I'm sympathetic to people who just have some vague notion of Mercury in retrograde having any meaning. Not because what you said isn't important or useful to understand. It's just far more complicated.
Right, and all of this stuff is complicated, which is why it tends to be hard to understand, and it's why general relativity wasn't invented until a century ago. I mean, if this stuff were easy, we would have figured it out thousands of years ago. I mean, it's the same thing with motions in the sky, and on the episode where we talked about retrograde, where you have all of these different motions, and they have to be explained, or we'd like them to be explained, by something that's easy. And while the model of the solar system is fairly straightforward, wrapping your head around different perspectives and things moving in different directions and observing them relative to other things makes it hard to understand.
Talk to you today about revealed preferences. I was on the Facebook the other day and came across this post, intentionally unattributed, although I doubt this person would care. It read, quote, "If I say that I care about something, but then don't have the willpower to do something about it, revealed preferences shows that I don't actually care. Better own up to it." I think this is a common sentiment, or rather, part of it is. Looking at people's behavior to infer their preferences is the common sentiment. Admitting publicly that you may be inconsistent is less so. Regardless, I think there's something wrong with it. As such, I'll briefly talk about revealed preference theory and why I think you should be wary of how you use it. The phrasing itself has an origin in economics, so let's start there. Putting on your economics hat, people... Yeah, I know you don't. You didn't think it was worth it to buy it as demand curve slopes down. People, or consumers we might call them, make choices based on their utility function, which is influenced by their preferences. Ooh. Well, how do you figure out what someone's utility function is? Well, it turns out that's very difficult. But how about instead we just look at what people buy to infer their preferences?
Sure.
The general idea is that someone would prefer a particular good or basket of goods compared to another good or another basket of goods given their financial constraints. This seems to work pretty well if I give you a choice right now between an apple and an orange, as it is highly likely you will choose the one that you want the most. You will choose what you prefer, and based on your choice, I can infer that was your preference. But in the real world, if someone buys an orange, it can be hard to know what is being compared. They could have bought numerous other things with that money, and it's hard to know if they really wanted that orange compared to an apple compared to some other item which wasn't even food. Mm-hmm. Additionally, there is, of course, an assumption of rationality, which often pervades many economics theories, which we know is not entirely true, but also that people's preferences are consistent enough to be informative. Of course, if you only care about what people buy, on some level you don't really care about their preferences, only what they purchase.
Sure.
So larger businesses only have an interest in preferences to serve that end.
Yep.
But I'm not a business, and my interests are much broader. I want to challenge an assumption hinted at, but that is very fundamental, that you are a fully unified self. I grant it often feels like your unified self, you're your center of narrative gravity and all that, humming along in your mind, the protagonist of your story. But we also know there's no center to the brain. If you open it up, there's nobody home. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means you, air quotes, which is always good in audio, are distributed in space and time. You're spread out across your brain in the symphony of neurons firing away, both from prior neuronal firing within the brain, but also signals transduced from your sensing the outside world, your sight, touch, taste, hearing, and so on. Why would we assume someone has a singular preference? We can easily think of examples where we didn't have a strong preference, or even when we did express a strong preference, but it was only strong at the time. Overeating junk food seems to me to be the best example. Mm-hmm. Cookies are delicious. Chocolate chip, not those raisin ones that masquerade as chocolate chip and a crime against humanity.
Oh, it's terrible.
Exactly.
Oh, I finally agree on something.
Yeah, finally. I will behaviorally express a strong preference for eating more than one cookie at a time. And yet, if I do eat, say, 3, it is likely the case that I will also experience regret about 5 to 40 minutes later. What kind of useful model of my preferences has me regretting them within minutes? To quote Walt Whitman, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Multitudes of cookies.
But Darren, doesn't eating cookies have more of a primal fat and sugar and in terms of our desire to eat it?
Excellent point, Pat. Yes, that is part of it. You have multiple competing desires. Mm-hmm. And as you indicated, not only do we have an evolutionary drive to consume sugar, fat, salt, and all the sort of delightful vehicles that are associated with that, which then may be different than our longer-term goals. And that's part of the issue. Your short-term preferences are not the same as your long-term preferences. Is it more reasonable to look at a fine-grained preference at a certain moment of time, or a reflected preference over longer periods of time? And you could make arguments about which one is more representative of you, or they both are, or neither are. And this is the point that I'm raising. It's very complicated. And it's even more evident in situations such as addiction, where part of oneself is overcome by another part. There are people who behaviorally express a preference in some way that they really want to keep consuming alcohol, and yet if you ask them, they would say, I don't want to do this, I hate this, I wish this wasn't my life, it's horrible. And so, well, what do you do with that information? Well, if you understand your nuance and not a fully unified self, it makes sense. Yeah. If you think your behavior reveals your preferences, oh no, that person just wants to keep drinking because they don't want to get better. Well, in some way that is true, in another way it's not true. So addiction is an extreme example, but it's kind of like everything we do. We just don't notice because things are often aligned, meaning your preferences are often aligned with your behavior, so you don't notice a dramatic inconsistency, except, minutes after eating too many cookies. As well, the brain works in complicated ways. The pathways that reward behavior may be different than those that give us a feeling of pleasure, although they often overlap. There's a link in the show notes at TRC Podcast that explores this further. Meaning, dopamine kicks in as a reward mechanism, which isn't the same as a pleasurable mechanism. They're similar, but they're different. So you could be motivated to keep doing things. This is like the addiction or even the craving of certain fat, sugar, salt that Pat alluded to, which could be different than what you would express as a different type of preference, which brings you pleasure. Yeah. In economics or business, you want to know if I'll buy the cookie or cookies. But I want to explore the nature of the self. I think a person is far more complicated than revealed preferences can, reveal, but it can be a useful concept in various domains and to challenge our stated preferences and gain awareness of conflicting impulses. And this is where I'm not saying it's garbage, I'm just saying be wary of how much you generalize. If someone keeps doing a certain thing and they say something opposite, humans tend to really dislike hypocrisy. Well, they really dislike it in other people. So at least there's an opportunity to explore why there's that inconsistency or why there's that hypocrisy. But, if you have heard me talk about this stuff before, this does build up to the case that anything like free will doesn't really make sense. If there's a causal fabric of the universe, so attributing choice and preferences to anything on some level doesn't make sense. Otherwise, it can be very useful in certain limited domains. So that was me talking about revealed preferences, and now I'm curious what the co-hosts think about revealed preferences and whether it reflects their true desires.
So two kind of examples I've heard the way that kind of illustrates this point, which I thought were interesting, were like, if you tell someone they're going to eat at a restaurant 5 times in the next 5 weeks and you ask them to pick a menu, they'll pick a bunch of different things. Yet if you ask them, like, at the table every time, they're more likely to just take the same thing. So if I go to Subway, I always get the same thing. But if you ask me to make a menu for a year, I might not decide that. And that would be dumb of me. And the other thing is, Netflix doesn't really care about the movies you put in your queue. They care about the movies you watch. Because a lot of people put, fancier movies in their queue or whatever, just different movies in their queue than what they end up watching. And there are many reasons for this, but it's kind of interesting.
So those are two great points. So take the second one first. Someone is revealing an intention.
Yep.
And then the behavior, of course, is what movies they actually watch. And from Netflix's point of view, as a business, they want to know what's going to bring in money.
Sure.
And to your first point about the menus, I'm aware of that as well. And it's the idea that if I have to pick 10 meals over the next 10 months, I'll want variety because that's my current thinking.
Yep.
But of course, if it's just once a month, I'll just pick my favorite item each time. And that would make me happiest. And this just highlights that you may not even know your preferences that would make you the happiest.
I've never heard the term revealed preference, but the fact that it's a way of revealing more about ourselves and maybe our purchasing habits. All I can think of is just when I'm searching for something online and then all of the ads are like, hey, you searched for this. You might like this.
Well, that's certainly cookies and algorithms trying to figure out what you want. So in some way, your behavior is definitely being used to infer your preferences. And of course, we know it's not perfect because, say, you just bought a watch and you still get ads for watches. And you're like, this is exactly what I don't need. If only there was a master algorithm to clean this up.
So it's not that algorithms are bad. It's just that they're not good enough yet, I think is really the problem. And I'm constantly frustrated at the inability of algorithms to be more competent. And I kind of get mad at them sometimes and say, you're supposed to take over the world. What are you doing wrong? Right?
I'm far more relaxed about it and happy we have computers at all. It's just how we look at the world, I guess.
Sure.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.